Oh, my goodness, absolutely not. Just thinking about if we just want to take the trauma that people live through. I have to say, Brittany, I am moved to tears every time I'm connecting with our team and staff in Gaza and our partners, because they even say, we don't know how we do it right now, but we get up every day because we have to rebuild. This daunting notion of rebuilding, just infrastructure, roofs over your head, basic nutrition, access to clean water, basic hygiene products, all of that is a huge amount of need, enormous. And we are not being allowed to bring aid in. We have had aid denied, new aid denied since March of this calendar year. We cannot get anything in. We get it denied for all sorts of reasons, or reasons that are.
You just heard it with your own ears. This humanitarian aid chief nearly in tears describing how Oxfam and organizations like them are being systematically blocked from entering Gaza with soap, with water, with food, with the most basic hygiene products that human beings require, not merely for dignity, but for survival itself. And I need you to understand what this really means, because this is not some abstract policy dispute about bureaucratic clearance mechanisms. This is the deliberate engineering of catastrophic human suffering on an industrial scale, and we have the receipts now stacking higher than the rubble that buries Palestinian children in their sleep. Since March 10th, 2025, the Israeli government has again blocked all aid entering Gaza, including fuel, in flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. And when I say all aid, I mean all aid, because Israel has now fully blocked the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza for over 50 days, and this represents what France, Germany, and the UK jointly declared as an intolerable humanitarian blockade that places 1 million children facing an acute risk of starvation, epidemic disease, and death. But here's where this gets even more morally obscene, even more calculated in its cruelty, because Oxfam has over $2.5 million worth of goods that have been rejected from entering Gaza by Israel, especially wash and hygiene items as well as food. UNRWA has over $7 million worth of life-saving supplies ready to enter Gaza, including 744 tons of rice, enough for 6 million meals, blocked in Ashdod just kilometers away, sitting there literally within sight of people who are dying from preventable diseases caused by the very deprivation this aid would alleviate. And I want you to grasp the full genocidal logic at work here, because unexperts expressed alarm at Israel's deliberate withholding of access to safe drinking water from Palestinians in Gaza, calling it a serious violation of international law and a crime against humanity, stating that Israel is using thirst as a weapon to kill Palestinians. And when UN human rights experts use language like thirst as a weapon, they are describing something that has a very specific legal and moral designation, which is collective punishment designed to bring about conditions of life calculated to destroy a population in whole or in part. This is not hyperbole. This is not progressive exaggeration. This Human Rights Watch documenting that thousands of Palestinians in Gaza have likely died and will likely continue to die as a result of malnutrition, dehydration, and disease stemming from Israeli authorities blocking access to food, water, and other supplies, constituting the war crime of using starvation as a method of warfare, the crime against humanity of extermination, and acts of genocide. Those are the actual legal terms being deployed by the most credible international human rights organizations on Earth. But wait, because it gets demonstrably worse, and I need you to follow this trajectory of escalating depravity. Israel cut off electricity supply to a desalination plant for drinking water in the occupied Gaza Strip a week after it blocked the entry of vital humanitarian aid, with Amnesty International calling this further evidence of Israel's genocide against Palestinians, as these actions are a clear indication that Israel is continuing its policy of deliberately imposing on Palestinians in Gaza conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction. And when the decision to disconnect electricity reduced the desalination plant's capacity to produce drinking water by 85% from 18,000 cubic meters of drinking water per day to just 3,000, that represents not a security measure but an act of calculated extermination through the denial of the most fundamental requirement for biological existence. 89% of Gaza's water and sanitation infrastructure has been damaged or destroyed by Israel's forces, leaving over 90% of households water insecure. And after 22 months of Israel destroying and restricting access to critical water infrastructure, the amount of water available in Gaza is wholly insufficient, with Israel deliberately depriving people of water in Gaza as part of its genocidal campaign that is denying Palestinians the necessities of life, as Israel's refusal to allow in fuel and equipment to repair damaged water pipes and desalination plants is making it impossible for people to get enough water, leading to deadly medical consequences. Now here's where American complicity becomes impossible to deny, and this is the part that should make every single person who considers themselves progressive absolutely livid with moral fury, because Israel announced it will stop the entry of all humanitarian aid into Gaza to pressure Palestinian militant group Hamas into accepting new terms for an extension of the ceasefire agreement, explicitly weaponizing the survival needs of 2 million human beings as a negotiating tactic. Under the terms of the ceasefire struck in the last days of the Biden administration in January 2025, Israel had allowed a surge of supplies into Gaza, but when the ceasefire collapsed, Israel closed all humanitarian access in an effort to pressure Hamas to agree to the terms of a hostage deal, marking the first time it had blocked all aid to Gaza since late October 2023, with the total blockade continuing for 11 weeks while the Trump administration stood back as remaining food supplies diminished and suffering increased. 11 weeks of total blockade while an American administration watched. And you want to know what their brilliant humanitarian alternative was? When Israel finally did allow a limited amount of aid to enter, it changed the primary food distribution model, mostly bypassing the United Nations and other established humanitarian organizations in favor of a brand new operation called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which sounds perhaps reasonable until you learn that more than 2,600 Palestinian civilians seeking aid were killed, and thousands more were wounded when being fired upon by the Israel Defense Forces, armed gangs and contractors hired by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, with most of the deadly incidents occurring in the vicinity of short-lived aid distribution sites operated by the U.S. and Israeli-backed GHF, with the killings taking place on the first day of the GHF's operations. Let me repeat that because it bears repeating until it sears itself into our collective consciousness. As of 31 July 2025, at least 1,373 Palestinian aid seekers were killed, with 859 killed near GHF sites and 514 near UN and other organizations' aid convoys, people literally murdered while trying to access food to feed their starving children at distribution sites backed by the United States government, and according to UN figures, more than 2,000 aid seekers have been crushed to death or killed by gunfire, which means the humanitarian mechanism that was supposed to replace the established UN system that actually worked has instead become a killing field. And if you think I'm being sensationalistic, in less than 4 weeks after the launch of the Israeli distribution scheme, more than 500 Palestinians have been killed, and almost 4,000 injured just trying to access or distribute food, with Israeli forces and armed groups, some reportedly operating with backing from Israeli authorities, now routinely opening fire on desperate civilians, risking everything just to survive. But here's the detail that exposes the grotesque moral bankruptcy at the heart of this entire operation. At least 10 identified members of the openly anti-Muslim group, known as the Infidels Motorcycle Club, were employed by UG Solutions as armed security for GHF in Gaza, with a further 30 members recruited from the gang, with armed contractors photographed in Gaza with banners stating FOB Mar-a-Lago and Make Gaza Great Again, prompting the Council on American Islamic Relations to state that putting the Infidels Biker Club in charge of delivering humanitarian aid in Gaza is like putting the KKK in charge of delivering humanitarian aid in Sudan. This is not a humanitarian operation. This is ideological sadism dressed up in the language of aid delivery, and 28 UN experts called for GHF's dismantlement, describing it as an utterly disturbing example of aid exploitation for military purposes. And I need you to understand the epidemiological catastrophe that this blockade has engineered, because disease doesn't wait for geopolitical negotiations to conclude. Waterborne diseases that are both preventable and readily treatable have increased by almost 150% inside Gaza over the past 3 months, as Israel continues to deliberately block aid, with available multi-agency health data showing that the numbers of Palestinians presenting to health facilities with acute watery diarrhea have increased by 150%, bloody diarrhea by 302%, and acute jaundice cases by 101%, and these figures are grossly underreported because most of the 2 million people trapped by Israel's continuing siege have little access to the few healthcare facilities that have managed to keep operating, with this surge of disease quickly turning deadly, especially as Palestinians living in Gaza have been deprived of enough food, water, shelter, and adequate healthcare for over 21 months. Israel has put Gaza under a near-total blockade since March 2 of this year, stopping all but a trickle of aid, with no longer any humanitarian aid reserves held by international agencies inside of Gaza. Which means when that diarrhea becomes fatal, when that jaundice progresses to organ failure, when children die from dehydration, there is nothing, no reserves, no backup supplies, just the sound of 2 million people being slowly suffocated by bureaucratic cruelty. Now let's talk about what constitutes reasonable security concerns versus what constitutes genocidal collective punishment, because the Israeli government and its defenders will tell you that these restrictions are necessary to prevent Hamas from diverting aid, but Israel completely blocked aid to the Strip from March, claiming that Hamas was stealing aid provided by UNRWA, but Israel did not provide any evidence for this, and also blocked UNRWA workers from entering the Strip from February, so the justification is evidence-free assertion used to collectively punish an entire population, and meanwhile, the obstruction is tied to new INGO registration rules introduced in March, under which registration can be denied on the basis of vague and politicized criteria such as alleged delegitimization of the State of Israel, with most major international NGOs unable to deliver a single truck of life-saving supplies since March 2, as Israeli authorities rejected requests from dozens of NGOs to bring in life-saving goods, citing that these organizations are not authorized to deliver aid, with over 60 requests denied in July alone under this justification, leaving millions of dollars worth of food, medicine, water, and shelter items stranded in warehouses across Jordan and Egypt while Palestinians are being starved. And between October 10 and 21 of 2025, Tepurpertine and Temkli Bose have had urgent shipments of aid, including water, food, tents, and medical supplies denied entry into Gaza, with 94% of all rejections by Israeli authorities given to INGOs, as 99 requests by international NGOs to deliver aid into Gaza were rejected, while 6 requests submitted by UN agencies were denied. Pleiter, so this is systematic exclusion of the organizations with the expertise, the infrastructure, the relationships, and the supplies to actually save lives, replaced with a militarized distribution scheme that has killed thousands, and a registration process designed to control independent organizations, silence advocacy, and censor humanitarian reporting, as this new bureaucratic obstruction is inconsistent with established international law as it entrenches Israel's control and annexation of the occupied Palestinian territory. Let me now connect this to the broader historical pattern, because this is not an anomaly. This is the culmination of decades of incrementally normalized oppression. Palestinians' access to food and water during the January 2025 ceasefire still did not reach pre-October 7, 2023 levels of access that was already severely restricted amid Israel's unlawful closure of Gaza since 2007, which means even before this war, even before October 7, Gaza was living under conditions of siege that were already violations of international humanitarian law. And now we're watching the final stages of what happens when the international community decides that Palestinian life is negotiable. The blockade has been credited with contributing significantly to the Gaza genocide, and when we use the word genocide, we're not being inflammatory, we're being precise, because in August 2025, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classifications Famine Review Committee announced, based on its reasonable evidence standard, that famine conditions are present in Gaza City and are projected to expand elsewhere in the Gaza Strip, which means internationally recognized famine, not food insecurity, not hunger, but actual famine, and WFP noted a 1,400% increase in food prices when compared to the ceasefire period, which lasted from 19 January to 18 March, pricing survival itself beyond the reach of people who have already lost everything. Now we need to talk about the obscene fragility of the current ceasefire, and why every single progressive should be demanding not just humanitarian access, but complete transformation of the power structures that enable this catastrophe, because Qatar's Prime Minister warned that the Gaza ceasefire is at a critical moment and could unravel without rapid movement towards a permanent peace deal, stating that what exists on the ground amounts to merely a pause in hostilities rather than a genuine ceasefire, as a true ceasefire cannot be completed unless there is a full withdrawal of Israeli forces alongside restored stability and freedom of movement for Palestinians, none of which have materialized. Israel's genocidal war on Gaza continues unabated, with some 600 violations of the ceasefire in the last 7 weeks, with Israel having killed at least 360 Palestinians since the October 10 ceasefire began, including at least 70 children. Because even under ceasefire conditions, even with international scrutiny theoretically at its highest, Israeli forces continue to kill with impunity. And under the ceasefire terms, Israel was to permit up to 600 humanitarian aid trucks to enter Gaza each day. But since then, the limit has been reduced to 300, and the Rafah border crossing was closed, with Israeli officials attributing the change to delays in recovering the bodies of Israeli hostages. Though Hamas previously indicated that recovering the bodies of some deceased hostages may take longer, as not all burial sites amid Gaza's widespread rubble are known, so Israel is cutting the already insufficient aid flow in half as collective punishment for circumstances created by its own military campaign that buried those bodies under rubble in the first place. This is the logic of occupation carried to its natural conclusion, where Palestinian survival becomes conditional upon Israeli satisfaction with the pace of hostage body recovery from beneath the ruins of buildings that Israeli bombs destroyed. I want to now address what this means for American progressives and why we cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the magnitude of what is happening, because a former senior U.S. official stated that they thought the tragedy of Gaza, with a humanitarian crisis that has played out for almost 2 years now, has fundamentally compromised American global standing, saying, quote, "It's a stain which everyone in the world sees even if we don't." And that official is correct, but understating the case because this isn't just a reputational problem. This is a moral catastrophe that implicates every American taxpayer whose dollars fund the weapons that create the rubble, that destroy the water infrastructure, that make the humanitarian blockade militarily enforceable. A U.S. plan approved by the UN Security Council hands oversight of humanitarian aid and Gaza's governance overall to a newly established Board of Peace, headed by U.S. President Donald Trump, but Israeli authorities have so far resisted relinquishing their grip on humanitarian efforts and have continued to restrict the entry of aid and sideline established organizations, including by using new NGO registration rules to deny nearly all requests from established international NGOs to bring goods and personnel into Gaza, which means American diplomatic initiatives are being actively undermined by Israeli intransigence, while American military aid continues to flow unconditionally. And here's what should radicalize every single person who believes in human rights and international law. Israel points to the massive influx of aid into Gaza, over 100,000 trucks, since the start of the war, and the resulting decline in food prices, especially in recent weeks, which it says contradict the famine assessment, but this is mathematical and moral illusion, because in May 2025, it was announced that prices had skyrocketed for basic foodstuffs at markets in Gaza, with a 25 kg bag of flour priced at $415 in Gaza City, a 30-fold increase since the end of February 2025. So yes, there might technically be some food entering, but it's priced at levels that make it inaccessible to a population that has been systematically impoverished by 22 months of military siege, displacement, and destruction of economic infrastructure. This is the neoliberal logic of manufactured scarcity applied to genocide. Create famine conditions, then point to the existence of unaffordable food in markets as evidence that famine doesn't exist. Let me bring this to the moral and political conclusion that demands action, because we are witnessing in real time the complete collapse of the post-World War II international humanitarian order, despite claims by Israeli authorities that there is no limit on humanitarian aid entering Gaza. Most major international NGOs have been unable to deliver a single truck of life-saving supplies since March 20, while the occupied Palestinian territory is the deadliest setting for aid workers worldwide, with Palestinian staff accounting for 98% of aid worker fatalities, with 509 out of 517 killings that took place between 2023 to 2025, which means the people trying to deliver aid are being systematically killed while being denied the ability to deliver that aid, and no aid has been allowed into the Gaza Strip since March 2025, representing the longest period of aid blockage since the start of the war, leading to shortages of food, safe water, shelter, and medical supplies. We are watching the deliberate starvation of a captive population, while the mechanisms designed to prevent exactly this kind of atrocity are being dismantled piece by piece. The woman in that clip, the Oxfam CEO, nearly in tears, describing how her teams get up every day to rebuild despite unimaginable trauma, talking about how they cannot get soap into Gaza, cannot get water purification equipment into Gaza, cannot get the most basic hygiene products into Gaza. This is not merely humanitarian crisis. This is the banality of evil operating through bureaucratic denial forms and arbitrary registration requirements and politically motivated aid obstruction. There is a grim and deliberate inevitability as to what Israel has created in Gaza. As each day that its siege continues and it denies aid, starvation becomes increasingly widespread, and human deaths from entirely preventable diseases becomes an absolute certainty. And that word deliberate is the key term, because we're not talking about unfortunate side effects of legitimate military operations. We're talking about the intentional engineering of catastrophic suffering as a tool of political control. This is the test of our generation. This is the moral litmus test that will define how history judges us, and right now we are failing catastrophically because for 20 months more than 2 million people have been subjected to relentless bombardment, the weaponization of food, water, and other aid, repeated forced displacement, and systematic dehumanization, all under the watch of the international community, with this normalization of suffering not being allowed to stand, as states must reject the false choice between deadly military-controlled food distributions and total denial of aid, as states must uphold their obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law, including prohibitions on forced displacement, indiscriminate attacks, and obstruction of humanitarian aid. Every day that passes without massive sustained international pressure to end the blockade, to restore humanitarian access, to hold perpetrators accountable, is another day of complicity in what international legal experts are increasingly willing to call by its proper name, genocide. Not metaphorical genocide, not hyperbolic genocide, but genocide as defined by the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide through the deliberate infliction of conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of a group. So when you hear that aid chief's voice breaking as she describes her staff in Gaza saying, "We don't know how we do it right now, but we get up every day because we have to rebuild," understand that she's describing resistance to annihilation. And when she says, "Nothing other than complete access to Gaza to deliver aid at scale can alleviate the conditions that people have been forced to live in," she's giving you the answer that should be the floor of progressive demands, not the ceiling. Complete access, immediate access, unconditional access to humanitarian aid at the scale required to prevent the completion of what historians will recognize as one of the most thoroughly documented genocides in human history, live-streamed and bureaucratically administered and defended by allies who call themselves democracies, while they fund the deliberate starvation of children who are dying not from bombs, but from the slower violence of denied soap and blocked water, and rejected medical supplies sitting in warehouses mere kilometers from where they're desperately needed. This is the depravity we're witnessing. This is the system we must dismantle, and this is the moment that demands we choose between complicity and resistance with the full force of moral clarity,